Good evening and welcome to the first pop-up lecture of the 2024 fall season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and our 11th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. What a great turnout. My name is John Carlton and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As many of you may know, we had to abruptly cancel our regular lecture earlier this month that was supposed to feature Kentucky Historical Society Director of Research and Publications, Stuart Sanders, and his presentation of his recent book, Anatomy of a Duel, Civil War, Secession, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. We are working with him to reschedule his presentation, so please stay tuned. As always, I want to acknowledge the incredible team that makes this lecture series possible. Thank you to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, to my co-organizer, Diane Dahoney, for her tireless efforts, to Cable 10 for recording and sharing these lectures with a wider audience on YouTube and Cable 10, and to the State Journal for giving us some great publicity. And I want to remind everyone that you can find flyers with the full schedule printed in the back, and you can find the schedule on the library's website and videos of past lectures on Cable 10's YouTube channel. Today's lecture largely rounds out the deep dive we've been taking into Frankfort's, Franklin County's, and Kentucky's deep history, from as recent as 300 years ago to as far back as 450 million years ago. We've discussed the pre-Pangea landmass called Laurentia, where portions of Kentucky were part of a Bahamas-like set of islands off Laurentia's coast about 450 million years ago. We've discussed the shallow sandy seas that once covered the state about 60 million years ago. We've discussed the importance of central Kentucky's karst limestone and shale and their influence on the formation of Kentucky's waterways, the types of flora and fauna that grew here, as well as hinted to their influence on ancient native peoples and on the industries of today, such as agriculture, horses, and bourbon. We've also discussed how the concentration of all these features made Kentucky a place that many different people over thousands of years found suitable for inhabiting, hunting, establishing permanent settlements, and raising their families. We've also incorporated the study of archaeology and its discoveries regarding 7 million years of primate development that eventually resulted in modern humans and our modern primate cousins. Tonight, we're looking again into the rocks of Kentucky, specifically at fossils, to learn more about the prodigious varieties of living things that have occupied this space before us. Just as archaeology is both a study of history and a scientific endeavor, paleontology is also both a study of history and a scientific endeavor. Paleontology, the study of fossils and ancient life forms, is an interdisciplinary field that weaves together threads from biology, geology, ecology, and earth sciences to reconstruct the history of life on our planet. From the majestic dinosaurs that roamed the earth during the Mesozoic era to the humblest microorganisms that inhabited the primordial oceans, fossils provide a tangible link to the past, allowing us to glimpse the evolution of life on Earth over billions of years. The story of paleontology begins with the earliest fossil discoveries made by ancient civilizations, including America's first peoples and Native Americans, who marveled at the strange and often inexplicable remains of creatures that no longer exist. Creatures whose remains may have served as the inspiration for large, ferocious monsters or other creatures in ancient stories and mythologies. The Greek philosopher Xenophanes, writing in the 6th century BC, is credited with being one of the first to recognize the significance of fossils as evidence of past life. However, it wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that the scientific study of fossils began to take shape and the foundations for modern paleontology being laid. Today, paleontology is a vibrant and dynamic field driven by advances in technology, interdisciplinary collaboration, and a deepening understanding of the Earth's history. Paleontologists employ a range of techniques, from traditional fossil hunting and excavation to cutting-edge methods like CT scans and ancient DNA analysis to uncover the secrets of the fossil record. Through the lens of paleontology, we also gain insights into the complex and dynamic relationships between life and the environment as we explore how ancient ecosystems responded to changing climates, sea levels, and geological events. By examining the fossil record, we can better understand the intricate web of life that binds us with our planet and with our larger family tree, and gain a deeper appreciation for the natural world. Kentucky, with its rich geological heritage, is an ideal place to explore the wonders of paleontology. From the ancient seabeds of the Ordovician period to the coal swamps of the Carboniferous period, the bluegrass state has yielded a treasure trove of fossils that tell the story of life on Earth over 450 million years. The Kentucky Paleontological Society, founded by our speaker today, has played a vital role in promoting the study and appreciation of fossils in the region. And we are honored to have him and his colleagues share their expertise with us this evening. So without further ado, please welcome Diane Dehoney, Community Service Librarian with Paul Sawyer Public Library, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. My name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian here at Paul Sawyer. And on behalf of everyone here, we just want to thank you for joining us this evening for another installment in this fantastic series. It is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight. Daniel J. Phelps is a native of Lexington and a retired environmental geologist with degrees from the University of Kentucky. Besides his environmental work, he has been employed as a petroleum and coal geologist. Additionally, Dan has taught part-time in Kentucky's community college system. In 2021, the Paleontological Society, the world's leading scientific organization devoted to studying invertebrate paleontology, micropaleontology, and paleobotany, awarded Phelps the prestigious Strimple Award, which recognizes outstanding achievement in paleontology by someone who does not make a full-time living from paleontology. In 2017, the National Center for Science Education awarded Phelps the Friend of Darwin Award, conferred annually to those whose outstanding contributions support the goals of NCSC. Phelps is founder and president of the Kentucky Paleontological Society also. Please help me to welcome to the podium, Daniel Phelps.
Well, thank you very much. I'm overwhelmed by the size of the audience tonight, and I really appreciate everybody showing up. After the talk, if you've brought in any fossils, I'd be glad to take a look at them and try to identify them. Tonight I'm going to talk about the different types of fossils we have in the state and where they're found geographically as well as geologically. And it turns out Kentucky is one of the best places in the world for invertebrate fossils. When you say paleontology, everybody thinks of dinosaurs and stuff like that. Unfortunately, we live in an area that didn't have any deposition going on while dinosaurs were around, at least in environments where dinosaurs would be likely to be found. They were probably walking around here, we just don't have any evidence to show what they were like. So Kentucky ends up being one of the best places in the world to collect invertebrate fossils, marine shells, evidence of ancient oceans, different life forms that live there. Over the years, we've found some significant fossils. This is a type of animal called an edrioasteroid. It's a relative of starfish and sand dollars. It's an echinoderm. And this is a new genus and new species we found over near Fort Knox. And unfortunately, we have to give, well, we don't have to, but anytime we make a significant fossil discovery, we tend to give our fossils to the Cincinnati Museum Center because Kentucky lacks a natural history museum. And it's a real shame that so many of our neat collections end up going out of state. Many of our university collections are languishing in basements where nobody gets to see all the really cool fossils that are out there. And we've been trying for decades to get a natural history museum going in the state of Kentucky. And the main problem is money, but also it has to do with the political process as well. Years back, we wrote a particular governor of the state who never answered the letter that we sent him about the need for a natural history museum. One of his aides wrote back to us, we have a history museum, why do we need a natural history museum? He didn't know the difference, and very discouraging. The famous historian Thomas Clark put together a nice proposal and got the legislature to pass it on the need for a natural history museum, but no money was put aside. So right now, unless we have somebody actually buy lottery tickets with the main intent of if I ever win, we'll have a natural history museum. Other than that, I would never blow the money. But anyway, I've been running this organization, the Kentucky Paleontological Society, since the 1990s. And it's a group of both amateur collectors, but also people that are scientific in their outlook and want to find things to study scientifically. And I think that's a good way of putting the organization together, because there's many groups that go out and collect fossils and stuff, but they do it because fossils are cool and pretty, which is nice on its own self, but we're trying to study the science of paleontology. So I like to try to make the organization science related. We have a website that doesn't get updated very much, and we also have a Facebook page that has more than 30,000 people on it. If they would only pay their dues, we would be a very wealthy organization and be able to bring in lots of speakers, famous paleontologists to talk about dinosaurs and stuff. So if you're interested, you can check it out online. As I said, Kentucky is one of the states that has a lot of invertebrate fossils. And the reason for this is that we are in an area where central Kentucky is rocks of Ordovician age, and as you go outward in both directions from central Kentucky, the Frankfort area, the rocks get younger in age. And you end up in limestones that form like Mammoth Cave region that are lower carboniferous. Then you have both eastern and western coal fields. And then you basically end up with just a little bit of the state that has a little bit of Cretaceous rocks, same age as the last of the dinosaurs. And the rest of that is Cenozoic in age, which is the last 50, 60 million years or so. And unfortunately, the topography out there is situated in such a way that collecting is very difficult because there's no outcrops. You have to find a stream or a creek to walk by. So the chances of finding fossils out there are rather remote. However, central Kentucky in particular is great for fossils because the glaciers didn't make it as far south as central Kentucky. We have rocks of the same age up in Ohio and southern Indiana, but you have to find rock quarries to get in to collect. Here in central Kentucky, the roads, as they construct the roads all through the region, there's lots and lots of these things called road cuts, where you see limestone on the side of the road, and it's really fantastic collecting. Additionally, we have creeks, quarries, old railroad cuts, all sorts of places where rock is exposed. And it turns out almost any place you see rock exposed in central Kentucky, there's some sort of neat fossil to be found. As I said, the central Kentucky area is all Ordovician fossils. The Ordovician lasted from about 490 million years ago to about 440, but most of the rocks in central Kentucky are in the last part of the Ordovician period. This is a period where life rapidly diversified, and we see a wide variety of fossils, different organisms, many of which are, all of which are extinct. A few belong to modern groups, but there's lots of fantastic fossils. The area had very rich tropical seas. The temperature and the climate of the time was very warm. And a good analogy to this would be like what you would see in the Bahamas today, where you have open freshwater or open saltwater marine situations with lots and lots of marine organisms living on the seafloor. Other parts of the world had a major glaciation at the end of the Ordovician, and there was a mass extinction event. So a lot of the different animals we find here in central Kentucky don't make it past the end of the Ordovician. There were a few land plants at the time, but the continents themselves are mostly barren. There's just a few moss-like animals that lived on the seashores. Here's a nice reconstruction. I think this is originally from the Field Museum in Chicago, showing a variety of Ordovician age fossils. Lots of the things we find around here, the big nautiloid cephalopods, trilobites, the state fossil brachiopods, horn corals, other types of corals, bryozoans, all sorts of neat stuff that it's just super abundant here. This is a reconstruction of the Earth during the Ordovician period. You can see in this reconstruction that North America is pretty much on the equator. We would have been in a similar situation as some of the tropical parts of the Caribbean as far as our latitude at the time. Additionally, the southern polar regions were rather cold. Many of the continents were grouped together in the Gondwana supercontinent, but North America was off by itself at this time period. As you can see from local outcrops, there's lots and lots of limestone to be found in local rocks. The rocks around here are almost predominantly coarse-grained limestones with intermittent shale deposits. Shale is clay minerals that have been deposited slowly out of ancient oceans. And we think that a lot of the deposition going on here in central Kentucky was due to storms churning up the seafloor, and as things settled out, the coarse-grained stuff would be in a single bed, and it'd be overlain by fine-grained material. Often the best fossils are found in the fine-grained material at the very top of some of these limestone beds. This is from the Curdsville limestone. You can see it's almost predominantly limestone with these shale partings. We also see evidence of other ancient storms. I took this picture over near Devil's Hollow Road. It's a rock formation called the Devil's Hollow member of the Lexington limestone. And you see these ridges. These ridges are ripple marks. This is from an ancient hurricane that stirred up the seafloor and left all these things like you would see on a beach or in the ocean today, where the current has sorted out the sediment in such a way that it leaves ripples. They built a bank on top of this, but there's other places in the region where you can see similar ripple marks. There's places up on 127 north of here that have fantastic ripples. And these ripples are made of limestone, and if you look at them really close, almost every fragment of the limestone is made up of little echinoderms called crinoids, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some of the different fossils that we find in central Kentucky include these sponge-like organisms called stromatoporoids. They're extinct, and for a long time there was a lot of debate about what stromatoporoids really are. We found modern relatives of them that appear to be closely related to sponges. Usually these are recrystallized inside, so it's been very heavily debated exactly how they relate to modern sponges. They live like sponges, but we're not 100% sure of their classification. Many times these will be covered with little bumps, and these are called mamelons because they're little breast-like features on the surface of the fossil. Some of these get quite huge. You can find these in local outcrops. Up on 127, the giant outcrops as you head north out of town towards Monterey, there's outcrops that have huge mounds of these sponge-like organisms preserved. Almost impossible to collect, but you can take good pictures if you can't collect things. Here's a sponge that was found locally in the Brannan siltstone. It's one of the best fossil sponges I've ever seen. It has the body of the animal itself, the sponge, and the little hair-like features called the bisa that attach the sponge to the sea floor. Somebody found this locally, and we begged them to donate it to the Cincinnati Museum, and they put it in their aquarium instead. So that was a bit of a disappointment, but we got some good pictures of it. And sponges are one of my favorite things. There's a sponge that's found locally called Brachiospongia. I first encountered these when I was an undergraduate at UK, and they're some of the most spectacular fossil sponges ever found. And they were found here in Frankfort in the 1860s. They were first described by the famous paleontologist Marsh, famous for the bone wars and all the dinosaurs he dug up out west. But one of the things he studied was the fossil Brachiospongia, and he found these just off of US 60 on a place called Sheeppen Branch Road. And I spent a whole summer trying to find these and never could find a single one. They're in museums worldwide. These specimens you see in this picture here are in the Field Museum in Chicago. And I spent years looking for these. And finally, one time I was down near Danville looking at a much older rock unit, still in the Ordovician, and managed to find a whole deposit of these. They're preserved in a different way, but they're still brachiosponges. This one's a couple of feet across. I don't have anything for scale to show you how huge this one is. It's not replaced by silica like the ones from here in Frankfort. Here's one I found in fragments down near Danville a few years ago. And this is how it looked when I first found it and had it in a cardboard box. And after careful preparation, here's what it looks like today. and the specimens over here on the table. I'm eventually going to give all my brachiosponge specimens to the Cincinnati Museum Center, unless we have a natural history museum here in Kentucky. But they're really spectacular. They only are found in a few places around the world. There's a few down in Tennessee, but almost all of them come from here in central Kentucky. So this is something to keep your eyes out for if you're walking through creeks and stuff here in central Kentucky. If you find one of these, it's a really important fossil. And I'm really hoping that people will make sure these end up in museums rather than personal collections. I've written a small abstract for the Kentucky Academy of Sciences on these many years back, but eventually I hope to publish an entire paper on the ones from down in Danville. Other fossils we have include horn corals. Kids find these all the time and they think they found a fossil dinosaur tooth. And I always hate to break it to them, but it's actually more than twice as old as the oldest dinosaur. And these are corals that are horn-shaped, hence the name, horn coral. More technical name are called rugose corals. But these are solitary corals for the most part, at least in the Ordovician. We have younger examples of these that form colonies, so you'll have whole groups of them together. But this is a horn coral. More common than corals are another totally different phylum of animal called a bryozoan. Bryozoans make up a good proportion of almost any rock you pick up here in central Kentucky. They look like little twigs and sticks. People think they find bones when they find these, but they're actually little colonial animals. Sometimes they'll be massive colonies. Sometimes they'll be like little twigs. Other times they'll form little domes where they grow on top of the shells of other animals that have died on the seafloor, and they grow on top of them. And if you get out a magnifying glass, you can see there's thousands of little pores, and each of these little pores was an individual animal from the colony. And when the animal was alive, it had this thing called a lophophore. It was like a little fan that would reach out and catch particles out of the water, and that's how it fed and grew its shell. But these are super abundant. You can pick up rocks that are just completely made up of these things. Sometimes the little cap-shaped ones, you can turn them over and find interesting things on the bottom. Sometimes they start out on brachiopod shells, but I found ones that started out on trilobites, and I actually have one that started out on a snail. And you can see the fossil snail underneath the bryozoan colony. And these are sometimes nicknamed the chocolate drop bryozoan. Here's a more typical type, just the branching type. If you look really close, you'll see little pores all over the surface of this bryozoan colony. Here's one of the few that you can identify without using a thin section. Usually when scientists look at bryozoans, we make thin sections of them and look under a microscope to see how they're organized, and we can identify which species based on the little tubes that make up the colonies. This is one that you don't need to make a thin section of because of the little star-shaped things called monticules all over the surface. This is called constellaria. And sometimes constellaria will be super abundant in some of the local rocks. And this is one of the few bryozoans you don't need a thin section in a microscope to actually get to the genus and species level of identification. Our state fossil are brachiopods. Brachiopods are still around in the oceans today, but they're super abundant back in the Paleozoic. It turns out back in the Paleozoic, things that we take for granted today, like clams and other bivalves, are fairly scarce in the oceans, but brachiopods are super abundant. A lot of this has to do with the chemistry of the ocean at the time and the evolution of life at the time, and the composition of seawater and how the seawater composition sort of favored the secretion of these types of shells. These animals are somewhat different than bivalves in their internal structure. They have a different symmetry. They're their own different phyla of organism. They're not clams or bivalves or anything like that. They're their own group. And this one is one that was named Platystrophia in the scientific literature for many years. And the way paleontology works, we use the Linnaean classification system. And it turned out somebody had described this previously as a different genus called Vinlandistrophia. And local paleontology types are always upset that we call these Vinlandistrophia now rather than Platystrophia. It's one of these things that people get upset about name changes when it really doesn't matter that much. It's one of these things that just knowing what the type of organism is and how it related to its surrounding is the really important thing. But this is a Vinlandistrophia brachiopod. Other types of brachiopods are somewhat different. Some are really flat. And this is one called Raphnaskina. It's named after Constantin Rafinesque, the famous biologist that worked at Transi back in the 1820s and 30s until he was kicked out by the dean whose wife he was cheating with. Rafinesque was an unusual character, and they named this brachiopod after him. And these are really flat and thin, and you can many times they're preserved, like the ones you see here, with both valves intact. You think you only have one valve, but actually, if you turn it over, you see that you have both of them together. A gentleman brought in a piece of limestone earlier that was made up of nothing but fragments of these. These were super abundant organisms. So usually when you're out in the field, you don't collect these that much, but they often have things growing on them. And I always like to double check the Raphnaskina type brachiopods. These have little worm tubes on them. See these little cone-shaped things several places? These are called cornuleted worm tubes. And there's also a type of bryozoan that has encrusted this one. Looks like little moss-like structures. And occasionally you'll find something really neat like an edroasteroid. I have several specimens that have edroasteroids. They're a type of echinoderm. Looks like a starfish sitting on a disc. And they sometimes occur on the surfaces of brachiopods. So if you don't collect these, you still want to look them over when you're in the field just in case there's one of these neat fossils living on top of the fossil that you're looking at. Modern brachiopods tend to live in in deep, cold water. You can go places like South America, South Africa, and find these along the coast in very cool waters. But in the Paleozoic, they apparently lived in warm, shallow seas. And at the same time, the bivalves were somewhat scarce. These are what modern brachiopods look like. There's also a lot of mollusks in the fossil record here in central Kentucky. Usually you'll find these as preserved as internal molds. The shells of mollusks are made up of a mineral called aragonite. It's a type of calcium carbonate. And aragonite is not geochemically stable. So what you often will find is the fossil shell will be dissolved away and you'll have an internal mold showing what the internal structure of the fossil look like. And it gets really confusing sometimes. You'll find these little corkscrew type things that turn out to be fossil snails. And the fossil clams will be really odd looking. And that's because the shell itself has usually dissolved away. These are both examples from the Perryville member of the Lexington where the shell got replaced by the mineral silica, by quartz. And these weather out into the soil. And you can find these loose in the soil, and they're completely made of quartz. Apparently, quartz petrified the calcium carbonate that was making up the shell. And because quartz is so stable, when the limestone dissolved away eventually, when the soil was forming, the quartz left behind these fossils. So you can occasionally find fossils like this that are replaced by the mineral quartz. And this is how we know a lot about the relationship between the different types of these bivalves. Normally the hinges and stuff like that wouldn't be preserved, but they're preserved on specimens like this. Here's a type of gastropod that had a calcium carbonate shell that was made of the mineral calcite. It's called cyclonema. And these can be super abundant locally here in central Kentucky. In fact, this one came from US 127 about halfway up to Monterey. Sometimes you can find these by the thousands on the right outcrop. This one called cyclonema, and we'll see other cyclonemas in a few minutes that had a very interesting lifestyle. One of the most confusing fossils that we see, somebody had a picture before the talk, are nautiloid cephalopods. If you're familiar with the modern animal called the chambered nautilus, it has a coiled shell and looks like an octopus when it's alive. But it's really a different type of cephalopod, its own group of cephalopods. And these had aragonite shells as well. And what happens is the shell got filled in, the empty chambers of the shell got filled in with mud and marine deposits of different sorts, and the shell itself dissolved away. So what you see are where the empty chambers actually are. Some of these are only a few inches long, but some of these get to be in the 15 to 30 foot range. They were the largest animals of the Ordovician ocean, and considering the intelligence of modern cephalopods, they were probably the most intelligent animal in the Ordovician oceans as well. The predators, here's a model of one in the Field Museum in Chicago. It's a model of a very large type called Endoceras, and we found pieces of these around here. These could be quite huge. Like I said, they were predators, and we actually found examples of trilobites, the bite marks taken out of them, that were left by these big cephalopods. They had a little beak that they could leave a distinctive bite on other animals. So we actually have specimens that are of trilobites that were probably bitten by these. Here's one I found in the field that just weathered out just perfect. It was just covered with mud, and I rinsed it off a little bit, and it didn't need any preparation at all. But what you're seeing is what was once empty chambers, and there's this little tube that connects all the chambers together. And in a living animal, it pumps fluid and gases and stuff in and out of those chambers to change its buoyancy like a submarine does. So these animals are really cool. I have a model of a modern chambered nautilus that you can look at after the talk. So the biggest ones of these are quite enormous in size. The endocerids, like Chimeraceras, got to be in the 30-foot range. But we only found pieces of them. Here's what the internal anatomy was like. I mentioned the tube that connects all the chambers. You quite often see this on specimens that you find, and of course the individual chambers. Some of these were probably encrusted with other organisms while they were still alive. These are bryozoans that were growing on a surface of the cephalopod shell. And you see these little bumps on the surface of the bryozoan. They're all sort of oriented in the direction the current would have been when the animal was moving around. And this is evidence this animal wasn't something that just died and fell to the seafloor and got encrusted. It still had these animals growing on top of them while it was still alive. So you can find all these little paleoecological things in the rock record that are really, really interesting sometimes. There's other weird fossils in the Ordovician around here. We occasionally find red algae. And I have a specimen of this that came over from near Mount Sterling. When these are cut and polished, you can see individual cell walls and growth lines and stuff like that preserved in the rock. They're quite beautiful when they're cut and polished, and they're called thrombolites because they look like little swellings. You know, if you have swollen legs, it's called thrombosis. Well, these are called thrombolites, and it's a type of red algae. There's also jellyfish-like animals called conularia that are sometimes found in rocks around here. I found these on the east-west connector here in Frankfort before now, looking at some of the outcrops along there. One of the most spectacular animals that you can find around here in central Kentucky are crinoids. Crinoids are still around in the ocean today, but they're rather rare animals today. Most modern crinoids live in very deep water. There's a few examples called feather stars that you can find in shallow water, but for the most part, modern oceans, the crinoids are found in very deep waters. But here in Kentucky, we find them in what was once very shallow marine limestones. These animals are attached to the seafloor by a thing called a holdfast. Then there's a column that's called a stem. And the stem, when it falls apart, you find these little beads. They look like little washers in the rocks. And I'm sure almost all of you have probably seen this. Some people claim that Native American people made jewelry and traded these and call them Indian coins, and maybe, maybe not. I don't know enough about the archaeology. But the top of the animal is called the calyx. And that's where all the internal organs tend to be. And then you have arms that were quite flexible and have little tube feet on them. Because these animals, in spite of being called sea lilies, they're animals. They're related to starfish and sea urchins and sand dollars. They're echinoderms. And these echinoderms would catch little particles of food out of the water and use the tube feet to bring the particles down to the animal's mouth. So they were, in effect, filter feeding animals in the water currents. And the one here was found just north of here on 127. Had it professionally cleaned with an air abrasive machine. So all the little tube feet and pinnules and features are preserved. Here's some holdfast. This is where the animal was attached to the sea floor. Many times there's these things called hard grounds, where the rock lithified and animals actually encrusted the seafloor. Just like you would see barnacles growing on a dock or something today or on a rocky shore. There were animals that encrusted the seafloor. And these are crinoid holdfast. They weren't roots in the sense they didn't provide any nutrition to the animal. They just anchored the animal to the bottom of the ocean. Occasionally you find one like this that will have a snail attached to the very top of it. And this is a really interesting paleoecological detail. This is called coprophagism. And make sure your safe filters are on if you Google this particular term. This is something that most of the time when you Google it, you'll get examples of what your dog does in the backyard. And the name coprophagus means poop eating. And apparently there were certain types of snails that would attach themselves to the top of crinoids and spend their entire lives eating the crinoid's poop. And there's actually examples where specific species of snails only fed on the tops of specific species of crinoids. But this is referred to as commensalism. It's one of the first examples of this in the fossil record, where modern organisms, commensalism is where the two organisms interact and there's no detriment to either organism. It's not like a parasite where there's parasitism, where one animal is being harmed in some way. This is commensalism, where both organisms are sort of okay with what's going on. Here's some from up in Maysville. And each of these crinoid calyxes has a snail attached to right where the crinoid's butt was. We had starfish, or sea stars more properly, back in the Ordovician. Unfortunately, they were rather rare, and starfish, or sea stars and their relatives fall apart very rapidly after they die. This specimen came from up on 127 north of here, and it's actually an excellent example of a fossil starfish. You only see like parts of 3 arms, but it's actually one of the better starfish from around here. These animals fall apart so easily after they die. Here's an animal that looks like a starfish, but isn't. This is called an edrioasteroid. It's one of my favorite types of fossils to study. The name edrioasteroid means star seat. And basically, you can imagine if you turned a starfish upside down and cemented it to some other substance, that it pretty much functions the same way as an immobile starfish. It's a whole group of animals that went extinct at the end of the Paleozoic. They typically have a disc, will be attached to things like other organisms, like brachiopod shells, occasionally bryozoans, sometimes just to the sea floor. There's even rare examples of these being attached to clams. But they have these 5 things that look like arms, but these were stationary. There were little tube feet. And the tube feet actually lead to a central mouth. So this would be a filter feeder that would catch little particles of food and bring the food to the central mouth. And many times they'll have a little bump, and that's where the the Edo asteroid's butthole was. It's called the paraproct, the more polite term. We found a new species, a new genus even, of Edo asteroid north of here on 127 a few years back. And actually I was co-author of a paper in the Journal of Paleontology about these. This is, you see the spiral shape of the arms. And this is only known from 3 specimens. One was already in a museum drawer in the Smithsonian, and one was in the collection of one of the members of the Kentucky Paleo Society, and the third was found on one of our field trips. There's probably a lot more of these out there, but if people find these, they turn out being really important fossils. They're really cool, about the size of a $50, so this is a rather large one. Then we have trilobites. Everybody wants trilobites more than anything else when they go collecting here in central Kentucky. And it's very easy to find the head and the tail and fragments of trilobites, but finding a complete one sometimes can be a little bit difficult. Trilobites were arthropods, distant cousins of horseshoe crabs, but actually more closely related to isopods and things like that. They're their own basic group of organisms that's not closely related to anything modern, in spite of us always talking about horseshoe crabs. There's a large one called Isotylus. It has very smooth surfaces. This one is enrolled. They roll up in a ball like roly-poly bugs do. If you ever turn over a log and find little isopods, we called them roly-poly bugs and pill bugs as kids. Well, they'll roll up in a ball to defend themselves. And back in the Ordovician, these were marine animals doing the exact same thing. Either a predator was bothering them, or the chemistry of the ocean might have had low oxygen or something. And they would roll up into a little contorted ball. Sometimes you'll find them outstretched, however. But you can find these both enrolled and outstretched. This one I found in Maysville. I was crawling up a rock face, and it was like that. It was just staring at me. It was pretty good. The only thing missing on this is the little calcite lens. Some types of trilobites have very complex eyes. These just have a little single grain of calcite, a little crystal of calcite as their eye lens. Then there's fossils that rarely show up. This is in the Cincinnati Museum Center collections, and the Cincinnati Museum just opened last fall a fantastic new exhibit on the local fossils of the Ordovician. This was found originally in southern Ohio. It's a sea scorpion, a type of animal that's referred to as a eurypterid. Eurypterids were a really unusual group of predators, and they're very closely related to scorpions. But they lived in the oceans. The largest one got like 8 or 9 feet long. This one is known from a single example that has most of the body and lots of fragments that have some of the claws. This animal had claws it was an active predator. A few claws have been found in the Mount Sterling area. Here's a reconstruction based on all the known fragments. It's showing the top and the bottom of this. This was published back in the 1960s, but it's based on the specimen you just saw for the body and some of the known pieces of the claws. Here's a modern artist reconstruction of what the animal looked like, something that you wouldn't want to go swimming with very, very often. It's a rather nasty looking organism, but it'd be really wonderful to find pieces of these. So it's one of these things that you really need to keep your eyes peeled for, because usually you're not going to find a complete one. It's going to be a fragment like this. All right, into the Ordovician, there was a glaciation and there was a mass extinction. And a lot of the animals we find here in central Kentucky went extinct at that time period. Next period in geologic time is referred to as the Silurian. And the best outcrops of the Silurian are between Louisville and Bardstown. And there's a very narrow outcrop bed from the Berea area all the way up to Lewis County that have Silurian age rocks. Typically, the water was very, very warm during the Silurian. It was the recovery after an ice age. And around here, the seas were very high in magnesium, and we end up with a lot of the rock type called dolomite. Dolomite is a magnesium carbonate instead of a calcium carbonate. And these are very, very common on outcrop to find evidence of these ancient warm seas in the form of dolomite. On land, there were probably some of the first land arthropods and land plants for the first time. But in Kentucky, our fossils tend to be things like fossil corals and crinoids and stuff like that. Here's a reconstruction of North America during the Silurian. I did my master's thesis on the Louisville limestone. It's a dolomite rock unit that's found in the Louisville region, and hence the name. But it's also important for petroleum. Lots of times when the rock turned to dolomite, it left lots of pore space that traps oil and gas quite well. But here's a reconstruction of the world during the Silurian. And you find lots and lots of corals. This is a type of coral called the chain coral, Halicites. These are found in the Louisville region quite abundantly and in southern Indiana as well. The coral has actually been replaced by the mineral quartz. And I always discourage people from ever using acids to clean fossils. But in this case, because the coral has been replaced by the mineral quartz, you can dissolve away the dolomite and leave the colony in really nice detail. You can see the top of every little corallite making up this chain coral. And what I did was I just basically dipped it in acid for a few days to bring out the details. Other than rare examples like this, never use acids to clean your fossils. It'll destroy important surface detail. I'm always discouraging people from doing that, and people always want to dip their fossils in acid. Please don't do that. Other fossils found here in Kentucky in the Silurian include brachiopods. They're far more common in southern Indiana. We have one type here called Pentamerus that forms reefs in the Bardstown area. There's also Silurian trilobites. Typically, the trilobite shell has dissolved away, and these actually are found in abundance over in the Bardstown area. There's one place I can take people, I can guarantee you'll find a trilobite, but you need a sledgehammer to get it out of the rock. Apparently, these things are fossilized in dolomite, and the trilobite itself is dissolved away, and you end up pounding on the rock with a sledgehammer, and it will break, and you can actually see the fossil will pop out as a complete trilobite. But it's actually a mold. It's not the actual shell of the trilobite, it's just a mold of the trilobite. Devonian rocks are somewhat more common in Kentucky. They include all the really cool stuff you see at the Falls of the Ohio. If you ever get a chance, go to the Falls of the Ohio State Park in Clarksville, Indiana. Kentucky technically owns the river, so it's really our fossils. But it's Devonian age corals in the greatest abundance you'll probably ever see. But the Devonian tends to be very warm overall, but towards the end of the Devonian, there were various times of glaciation. There's areas that had stagnant oceans, I'll show you examples of, and you get some of your first major land plants and your first examples of terrestrial vertebrates. Animals like the transition between the tetrapod fish, or the tetrapodomorph fish and the early tetrapods occurred during the Devonian period. If you're familiar with the famous fossil Tiktaalik that was found in Arctic Canada, it dates to this time period. But at the Falls of Ohio, there's just tons of these horn corals, but there's also fossil sponges, lots of different types of corals, and just unbelievable numbers of other fossils. There's nothing to collect there. You would need a stick of dynamite to collect anything there. But there's places in local quarries, if you really want a piece of the rock, you can go to a quarry and find the same stuff. But it's best just to take pictures at the falls, and besides, you won't get arrested if you only take pictures at the falls. Here's a reconstruction at the falls of some of the organisms. There were different types of corals, different types of cephalopods, different types of crinoids, all found in the rocks there at the falls. This is a reconstruction of some of the very large horn corals found there, as well as there's some really large types of snails that occasionally turn up at the Falls of the Ohio as well. Here's a piece of rock from a local quarry that I cut and polished. And this thing that looks like maybe the Cookie Monster or something looking at you is actually a horn coral. You can see it in cross-section. Here's another coral, but a lot of these things that look like twigs and branches are types of sponges. They're probably stromatoporoids, the fossil we talked about much earlier. Latest most part of the Devonian, we have these black shales preserved. The shales are black because they are very rich organic matter. They reflect a time when ocean circulation was very low and that anything organic sank to the seafloor and there was low oxygen and it didn't decay very well. This was really rich in organic matter, and for many years people were proposing to mine this to get petroleum out of it. That would have been an ecological disaster if we had done that. But this is in the subsurface, the source rock of a lot of the petroleum we have in Kentucky. Basically, there's fossil algae preserved in this, and the kerogen from this fossil algae actually makes up a lot of our petroleum here in the state. Fossils in this tend to be very scarce, at least on the large scale. You can easily recognize the black shales when you're coming down the highway. The rock tends to be very fissile. It will break into thin sheets if you pick up a piece of it. This is over near Bernheim Forest. But if you get on I-64 East, a few places, there's, on the way to Moorhead, you can see big outcrops of this. Something that happens very rarely is you find fossil plants preserved in this. This is examples of some of the oldest petrified wood in the world. This is a type of tree called Calixolon. These trees were probably living up in New York State and southern Ontario, and they died and fell out into streams. It got washed into the ocean and eventually became waterlogged and sank here in central Kentucky. And you find these in the Devonian black shales in places where the shale has been heavily weathered. So people find these in the creek beds around Bernheim Forest, different places in southern Indiana. There's one from Clay City in eastern Kentucky that's on display in the Smithsonian. And it's a log that's about 25 to 30 feet long. But this stuff is beautifully preserved. It's not colorful like a lot of the younger fossil wood from out west, but it is some of the oldest fossil wood you can conceivably find. And I think I have a slide out of order here. I don't. But anyway, you can actually see cell walls in some specimens of this. You can cut and polish it, and I actually have a specimen. It's just a little tiny fragment from southern Indiana. It's been cut and polished, and you can see the individual cell walls preserved in this fossil wood. Another neat fossil that we find pieces of here in Kentucky, and it's better known from Ohio from the black shales, are these fossil placoderm fish. It means plated skin fish. The heads of these fish is covered with bony armor. Most famous of these is called Dunkleosteus, and you'll see casts of this on display at various museums. This fish got to be in the 25 to 30 foot long range. It's pretty much just gigantic in size. It's one of the first examples of a fish with jaws, but it didn't have teeth in the jaws. It has these pink and shear-like slicing features instead of teeth. But you find the fragments of these in various places. This isn't a fossil, but I thought it was a pretty neat item that came up in a stream near Moorhead. This is a boulder that a geologist was walking through the stream, just looking at the black shales in this outcrop, and found this granite boulder. And they looked at it in more detail. First thought was, well, maybe this is some sort of glacial boulder that's been brought in from up north. But people looked at this in more detail, and it turned out that the black shales actually cover the edges of this. This is probably a drop stone from back in the Devonian period, where the shallow, stagnant ocean was there, and a glacier had calved off a piece of rock inside of an iceberg. And when the iceberg finally melted, it dropped this boulder, which probably weighs a ton or better, into the black shale. And it left this big piece of granite on the seafloor that got covered with other shale. And this is some of the first evidence for major glaciations happening in North America during the late part of the Devonian period. And it's very near the Walmart in Moorhead, Kentucky. There's field guides that'll show you how to get to it. You have to ask permission to park, though, and the woman doesn't like geologists for some reason. So in the early Devonian, North America was pretty much still close to the equator, but the continents are starting to move together. You see some of the ancestral parts of the Appalachian Mountains starting to form. This is followed by the Carboniferous. Here in Kentucky, it's divided, in North America in general, it's divided up into the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian periods. Typically anymore, we just use what the rest of the world does and call the Mississippian the lower Carboniferous and the Pennsylvanian the upper. But this is lower part of the Carboniferous is mainly limestones here in Kentucky. Places like Mammoth Cave are particularly famous for all the limestones during this time period. In fact, there's probably more widespread Mississippian age limestone in North America than any other time in Earth history. We find very similar rocks all the way out to Colorado and further west. By the end of the Mississippian, the Appalachian Mountains started forming. And eastern Kentucky was sort of becoming shallower and shallower ocean-wise. And we get our coal swamps that led to our coal deposits during this time period. For the first time in the history of life, oxygen levels probably became very, very close to what they are today, if not exceeding that today. There was a large southern hemisphere ice cap because all the plant vegetation was sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But this is the Upper Carboniferous is the major building part of the Appalachian Mountains. And in eastern Kentucky, we can find coal bed after coal bed. And sometimes as the glaciers melted in the southern hemisphere, water levels would change, and we'll have marine beds within the coal fields where we can find marine fossils. So as the glacial caps waxed and waned during the Upper Carboniferous, we find a variety of fossils in our Carboniferous rocks here in Kentucky. Mississippian, of course, is referred to as the age of crinoids. We have neat crinoids here in the Ordovician, but nothing compares to the Ordovician age of crinoids. You'll find entire rocks that are made of nothing but crinoid debris. This is a rock type that is no longer forming today anywhere on the planet because crinoids are fairly scarce animals today. But during the lower part of the Carboniferous, crinoids were so super abundant that you find entire rocks made of nothing but crinoid debris. Like I said, these are called sea lilies, but they're really echinoderms. Here's a geologic reconstruction of North America during the early part of the Carboniferous. And there's just massive limestones. You can go places and find just unbelievable amounts of limestone in the quarries. It's very economically important as well. There's a neat fossil that's sometimes found called Archimedes. It's one of the few screw-shaped animals that have ever lived. It's a colony of bryozoans. And these were filter feeders, and for some reason the screw shape gave it very efficient ways of being a filter feeder. The water currents would circulate around the screw-shaped item, and it usually has a very fine fan attached to this. And of course, Archimedes is named after the famous Greek scientist that invented a pump that was screw-shaped, and that's why the fossil has the same name. Other fossils we find, instead of straight-shelled cephalopods, we find coiled ones, referred to as ammonoids. These are the ancestors of the ammonites from the Mesozoic. Here's what it would have looked when it was alive. Here's a specimen from near Moorhead. Here's a specimen from Big Hill near Berea. It's inside a big nodule that I've broken open. Here's a coiled one here, and there's a straight-shelled one here. So both types lived alongside each other. Here's a rock made of nothing but crinoid debris. If you get down at Lake Cumberland, it's unbelievable how many crinoids you can find. 99% of what you see are the individual stems and discs, but occasionally you'll find the head, the calyx, stuff that looks like this. A friend of mine that was going to come tonight and canceled on me, named Ann Watson, discovered this specimen. We were up near Moorhead collecting fossils, and she picked up a slab for the bryozoans that were covering one side. She cleaned it up and turned it over, and on the bottom is one of the most fantastic crinoids I've ever seen. It has the holdfast where it was attached to the seafloor, has the entire stem, has the head, and all of the arms. And I thought that was just a spectacular specimen. We also find these things that people, when they find them, they think they found fossil hickory nuts. They're called blastoids. They're a cousin of crinoids that are extinct. They're particularly common in Mississippian age rocks, lower Carboniferous age rocks. And they were very similar to crinoids, but they tend to have much shorter stems, and usually you'll find the stem attached. And then you find the calyx. When the animal was alive, it has all these things, little bristle-like things called ramules all over the surface that were used for filter feeding, just like crinoids. And if you look at the very top of these, you'll see the mouth and the butthole are right next to each other on these animals. Edroasteroids were still around in the Carboniferous, and this is a large one that the club found near Radcliffe. And we donated all our specimens to the Cincinnati Museum Center, and they named it after the Paleontological Society. It's called Torcariscodiscus kypsii, and the kypsii means KYPS. They Latinized everything. But these are about the size of a silver dollar, and it has these very snaky arm-like things called ambulacrals. And this is where all the tube feet were located, and the central mouth would have been right in there. Same outcrop, I managed to find several shark teeth over the years. This is some of the earliest examples of sharp shark teeth. It's called a cladodont shark. Cladodonts were particularly common during the Devonian through the upper part of the Paleozoic. This is only about an inch across, the very tip of it's broken off, but it's still a nice example of a cladodont shark tooth. Here's a shell-crushing shark tooth from the same outcrop. Shell-crushing shark teeth are much more common. They tend to be associated with animals that were close to rays and skates and things like that are in the oceans today. But they would eat crustaceans and other crinoids, anything they could get and crush up using these smooth teeth. There were some really unbelievably large sharks out there, though. This is called Edestus. This was found in the roof of a coal mine out in Henderson County, about 800 feet underground by a coal miner. And it ended up in a museum, but he ended up, he was from a poor family. I understand he wanted money, and he managed to sell it, and the guy that bought it from him, I think, donated it to Cincinnati. But this is about a foot long, and it's a jaw fragment. Usually the jaws aren't preserved. This was originally cartilage, and here's the teeth. And Edestus has been known for more than a century, and there's always controversy on how to reconstruct the animal. This is one of my favorites. It's from a museum in Alaska. These animals were very bizarre in the shape of their teeth. There's some that we don't find in Kentucky that have these helical-shaped teeth. They actually curl. It's called helioplacoid sharks. And there's all sorts of debate about how they use this really weird arrangement of teeth. You want to think it was like a party flavor, you know, those things you blow, but no, it was stiff. It was stiff, so it wasn't like that. I helped find a rhizodont lungfish a few years back. This came from Hancock County, Kentucky. This is the lower jaw, has teeth larger than a Tyrannosaurus's jaw. This is a large lungfish. I was out with Todd Hendricks doing field work, and people from this geological survey that was looking at several states at once found one interesting fossil at the site and said there were no more fossils at the site. Well, Todd and I go out there and we find a shitload of fossils. It was, every place you looked, there was bone. There were fragments of the jaws of early amphibian-like animals. And there were big bones that turned out to be part of this animal. Later on, the Cincinnati Museum Center, they got permission from the Department of Transportation and just excavated the whole outcrop and found this jaw fragment. It's just fantastic. There's a lot of other parts of the skull preserved as well. One of the other neat finds there, this is a lungfish still in the burrow. If you're familiar with modern lungfish, they're a type of fish that can gulp air. They have a primitive lung as well as their swim bladder. So they can live in ponds that have low oxygen content. And what happens is the ones alive in the world today live in parts of Africa and Australia, and they'll live in ponds that dry out seasonally. At the end of the wet season, they dig a burrow down into the mud and end up forming this layer of mucus all over the fish's body, and they will encase themselves in this mucus layer until it starts raining again, and sometimes it'll be dry for 3 or 4 months, and the lungfish will stay in what's called estivation. And this is referred to as an estivation burrow. Well, this particular lungfish dug the burrow, but it didn't come back as rain in time, and it died in this position. And you can see, not only is the skull complete, but here's all the different ribs and other parts of the fish's anatomy. And this is from a really cool site out in Hancock County. Late Carboniferous, the Appalachian Mountains are starting to form, and you get more terrestrial environments here in Kentucky. Get down to Hazard, this is the famous Four Corners outcrop. Fantastic plant fossils can be found here. We go every November. We wait till the snakes and the weeds are down a little bit and walk some of these benches. And I think Dan and Kim and a few other people here have been on that trip. And you find all sorts of neat fossils. There's a marine zone near Hazard where you find ammonoids. This is a really nice ammonoid from one of the marine zones. But most of what you find are from the ancient coal swamps. I think this is from the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. But you find little imprints of leaves, and the leaves will be replaced by carbon. Or actually, the original carbon from the leaf is there. It's just decayed away. And what you do is you split open layers of shale, and it ends up these beautiful imprints of different types of ferns. This is part of a horsetail plant leaf called annularia. Here's a seed fern. It looks like a modern fern in some ways, but these actually reproduced with seeds, hence the name. Modern ferns reproduce with spores, but there were types that were ancestors to the gymnosperms that are actually produce seeds. And sometimes people will find the seeds of these. Here's another one from Eastern Kentucky. And yet more. It's just, we have like world-class Pennsylvania age plant fossils from Eastern Kentucky. It's just a matter of getting access to the right spots. The place we've been going for years has gotten worse every time. The outcrop keeps collapsing, and it seems like we get fewer and fewer fossils all the time. Occasionally find the stumps of lycopod trees. These often lived in environments where there was high rates of deposition, and many times this would be adjacent to streams. And you can see this tree was growing, and it got killed probably by these different sediments filling in around it. But they were made of a really pithy-like material, and it got filled in with a different type of sandstone. And these are actually mine hazards in some places. These fall out of the roofs of coal mines. They're referred to as kettle bottoms. They've killed coal miners before now. Here's one from an underground mine. It's in display at the Field Museum in Chicago. And here's the great big one that was on UK campus for decades outside the Whitehall classroom building. When I was an undergraduate, I was taking a class called historical geology, and I made like a 98% on one test. The one question I missed was, what is the stump outside of Whitehall classroom building? I thought it was just a damn tree somebody cut down. I didn't pay attention to it. It was a fossil. This fell out of a coal mine in the 1950s, and it was reassembled and brought to Kentucky, brought to central Kentucky, and put on display outside Whitehall classroom building. And I think the university got a little sick of maintaining it, so they moved it over behind the Kentucky Geological Survey. But you can go and look at it and get pictures today. Here's how it formed. Basically, it was just a stump, got buried, filled with sand, and when people mined the coal, it ended up falling and landing on the ground. You can also find very abundant root systems of these big lycopod trees. Lycopods were basically very large club mosses. Modern club mosses are only a few inches tall, but these trees got to be 80 to 100 feet tall. And you find the roots like in the previous pictures. And sometimes you can find roots like this that have all these things where individual little rootlets were attached. And the surface of these was covered with a bark that had little rhombohedrons all over the bark. And people are always thinking, oh, I found a dinosaur skin, or I found fossil lizard skin. And it's one of these lycopod trees. There's one insect fossil known from near Manchester. A friend of mine, Don Chestnut, found it back in the 1970s. Here's a picture from the field guide that he published it in. Actually has color patterns. Didn't have any original color, but has the patterns preserved. And it was probably something similar to a modern caddis fly. But this animal is apparently very rare. I climbed up to the outcrop where he found this and couldn't find anything else collectible. A few ferns and no more insect parts. One thing I was successful in, a place we collect plants every year, I found an Anthracosaurus track. This is one of the few known vertebrate trackways from eastern Kentucky. It's one of the early land vertebrates that first had 5 fingers. And you can see where it walked out onto this soft piece of mud, and its forelimb left these prints. And here's a close-up of the best one of the prints. You'll see where individual toes ended in little nails. A friend of mine's an artist, and she put together this little paleo reconstruction of what the animal looked like. Anthracosaurs were sort of the common ancestor of both amphibians and reptiles. It's a really weird group of animals that only lived in the upper part of the Paleozoic. Well, from then on, Kentucky was pretty much a landmass for the rest of geologic history until the Cretaceous period. We had dinosaurs running around here, but we didn't have rocks that would be conducive to preserve dinosaur fossils. And because of this, we don't have dinosaur fossils in Kentucky. We do have a little bit of Cretaceous age rocks way out in western Kentucky, and they tend to be nothing but gravel, rocks that are basically unconsolidated gravel that aren't very good for preserving fossils. We would be part of the Mississippi embayment. The Jackson Purchase area was underwater, and there's a little strip of Cretaceous outcrop right near the land between the lakes. Most of the topography out there is very flat, and you need to get into people's personal backyards and stuff and get permission to collect. And even then, you get down in these streams, and it's all choked with vegetation, and it's almost impossible to find anything. There's always the potential for dinosaur fossils, but it's very unlikely that any would be there. Just a little bit south and down in place in Tennessee are found a few ammonites and other Cretaceous marine organisms, including some of the Mesozoic marine reptiles. And I think they even have a fragment of a dinosaur bone from somewhere in far western Tennessee. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, we have a little bit of Cenozoic. The rest of the Jackson Purchase, We have all sorts of neat things going on. We've had field trips down to a place in Mayfield, the town that was destroyed by the tornado here a few years back. They are a major clay pit company. They make all the toilet fixtures and ceramic pipes and stuff like that. They let us into the place where they process the shale, and we got to break open pieces of shale, and there would be beautiful fossil leaves preserved that still had some of the organic matter, and they would dry out almost as fast as you would break them open, and the fossil leaf would just sort of crumble and float away if a breeze hit it. You had to pretty much spray things with a mixture of water and Elmer's glue to get them to stay preserved. This is a piece a friend of mine, Rick, found. This is Metasequoia, a type of redwood. They were living here in Kentucky. Last 2 million years, the Quaternary part of Earth history, mainly the Pleistocene during our ice ages. There's widespread Pleistocene deposits all over the state. You always have the potential, if you're walking through a stream, of finding fossil bison, fossil elephants of different types, all sorts of these really neat Pleistocene megafauna. They show up here in Frankfort all the time. I have a fossil tooth of a mastodon somebody gave me years back that was found here in Frankfort, Kentucky. During this time period, we were undergoing an ice age. The glaciers got as far south as northern Kentucky. Here's an outcrop map showing pretty much the furthest extent of the glaciers. You get up around Newport, in that area you can find glacial pebbles and granite and stuff like that. But a little further south, we have the site that was the birthplace of vertebrate paleontology in North America. It was discovered by native people in time immemorial, and French explorers first started making note of this in the 1760s. This is referred to as Big Bone Lick. There's a salt lick there. And apparently, even during the Pleistocene, there was a salt lick, and animals would come and end up being just dying there naturally. A few were hunted by native people. And there's lots and lots of fossil bones in this particular location. The megafauna here in North America, and all these animals lived here in Kentucky, including some of the different types of mammoths and mastodons, the antique bison, cave lions, giant ground sloth. There's numerous examples of giant ground sloth fossils from here in central Kentucky. They turn up all the time, and people aren't expecting to find them. Here's the extinct species of bison. They excavated one of these at Big Bone Lick a few years ago. This is at the Cincinnati Museum Center collections. The picture of the skeleton here is from South America, but we had the same type of giant ground sloth here. I brought the claw of a large type of giant ground sloth, a replica of the claw of a large ground sloth, came from Central Florida. But these have been found here in Kentucky. Here's a skull. I think this came from Big Bone Lick. It's on display at the Cincinnati Museum Center. Here's a model of one. I'm really sorry these animals are extinct. They probably lived till late prehistoric times in South America. There's an example in a cave in South America of a specimen of skin that actually has the fur preserved. They had little bony plates embedded in the skin. We also had the short-faced bear. It actually doesn't have all that short a face, but this animal had such long legs that it could probably outrun a horse. These are just incredible predators. This is at the Field Museum in Chicago. Fossil in the foreground here is not native to North America. It's the Irish elk. It's a type of fossil deer that was found in Scotland and Ireland, but mainly in Scandinavia. It's neither an elk, and it's very rarely found in Ireland in spite of the name. In the background is a woolly mammoth skeleton. Notice the high forehead. This is a mastodon skull. Notice the teeth. I'll show you a better mastodon tooth here in a second. This is another example of a mastodon at the Cincinnati Museum Center. And a woman posted this to Facebook actually about a year ago. She found this over near Campbellsville. Had the photograph upside down thinking the roots of the teeth were the teeth and that these were the roots, but she had it backwards. This is one of the best mastodon teeth I've ever seen. And it came from a place in west central Kentucky that you would never expect typically to find stuff like this. But it's out there. It's just a matter of recognizing it when you're out in the field. And fortunately, I think I took this picture when it was donated to the Cincinnati Museum Center. And it was very fortunate she donated it because it was starting to dry out. The initial picture she sent was even better than this. But many of these Pleistocene fossils, when they start to dry out, they start to crumble. The moisture in them dries out and they start cracking and breaking. And they need to be in museums under very careful temperature control so they're preserved. Here's a giant beaver from southern Ohio. We almost certainly had these here. This is like 5 times the size of a modern beaver. Or it's about the same size as Justin Bieber. All right, last part is on humans. And one of the problems with being into paleontology, people are always trying to post artifacts and Native American artifacts and things to a Facebook page. People confuse archaeology and paleontology all the time. And it gets very irritating, but there are a few places where the two fields overlap. One is in the old world with human evolution and the early hominids and all that are found in Africa and other parts of the old world. But the second part is the peopling of North America. The debate over when humans first came to North America seems to be showing that there were a lot of people here before the Clovis people. I got this from a coworker many years back. This is a Clovis point from over at Winchester, Kentucky. It's not a very large one, but it's a really nice example, and I know it's genuine. There's a lot of counterfeits. These flint knappers really know how to make the fakes of these too. So I really cringe when I hear about people buying artifacts. They belong in museums. Yeah. This one will eventually, in my will go to the Cincinnati Museum Center. But here's some of the ones from the Smithsonian. This very distinctive type of point was used to collect or to kill megafauna by the native people, the Clovis people. But the thing is, these date to about 12,000 years ago, and there's increasing evidence for people being here as much as twice as old as that, more than 25,000 years ago. So why we're not finding the artifacts of these earlier people is a bit of a mystery, or maybe we are and just not recognizing some of the stuff. But anyway, if you find good fossils, want them identified, we have a Facebook page that somehow has 30,000 members on it. We have a monthly meeting. We meet at the Kentucky Geological Survey building in Lexington, usually the last Friday of the month, but our last meeting was last Friday because of Labor Day. We have about 11 field trips a year. We skip January for obvious reasons. February, we usually go to the Cincinnati Museum Center and see their research collections. And December meeting is usually a party, an auction of books and other stuff. But anyway, if you have fossils identified, feel free to email me photographs. Put it on the Facebook page if you feel like it. My contact information is right there. And I'd be glad to entertain questions in the little bit of time we have left.
Thank you, Mr. Phelps. Diane's going to get another microphone and walk around for questions.
Oh, okay.
We've had some audio issues doing it without a microphone in the past, so thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Oh, and I've got lots of specimens to look at afterwards too, if you.
Okay, if you have a question, if you'll just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
Dan, it's Lemoyne. I'm curious, the Milankovitch cycle for the glaciers coming and receding, and can you explain that, what a Milankovitch cycle
The
is?
cycle is an interaction of the Earth's orbit and orbital tilt. And each of these things, Earth's orbit around the sun isn't completely circular, it's elliptical. And it varies over like a 26,000 year period. Additionally, the tilt of the Earth's axis varies by a few degrees over a similar time frame. And there's several other factors involved. And it's thought that this influences why we have glacial periods and interglacial periods in the Pleistocene. This can be recognized in the extent of glaciers here in North America and other parts of the world by trying to tie these to different cycles. We can actually trace some of these in the Carboniferous, in the coal fields of eastern Kentucky, the arrangement of some of the marine zones. There was probably a similar Milankovitch cycle going on back then even. In times when the world's climate is very warm, it doesn't really seem to be much of a factor. But during times of glacial periods, it does seem to show up in the rock record, especially in seafloor sediments and the Earth's if you look at some of the different types of seafloor drilling project, the changes in oxygen isotopes and stuff, you can actually trace the different cycles over time.
Are we headed to another one?
We're probably, if not for human-induced climate change, we probably would be headed for another ice age. Of course, our own climate change because of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, even if we stopped everything right now, the temperature would probably increase for at least another 1,000 years. So we probably have put off an ice age by doing this, but the real problem is how fast we've affected the climate. And it's not that we've affected it, it's how fast. Last time the climate changed this rapidly was tens of thousands of years ago, and it still took hundreds of years to do what we've done in just a couple of a century or so, a century and a half.
Any other questions?
Oh, come on, you gotta have more questions. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hold on just a second. Let me bring you the mic so they can hear you on TV.
Oh, I was just wondering, as you were talking, it sounds like you can just walk along the interstate at some of these the rock outcrops, and would you be able to find fossils down at the bottom?
Yes, but I would argue against going to most of the interstates because of traffic concerns. But many of the side roads, I'm not sure always of the legality, but I've had state troopers help me collect before now too. So if you're sober, they'll leave you alone typically. The thing to watch out for is people throwing beer cans out of their window at you and stuff like that.
I'll do that.
But yeah, any place you see rock exposed in Kentucky has the potential. But there's some places that are a lot better than others, and your efforts are better spent. And of course, safety is always the most important.
Hi, Dan. I'm Susan Goddard. I'm on you were talking about not cleaning with acid. What are some of if you do find things, what are some of the best ways that you can tell us that we should clean them and preserve them? And could we send you pictures of them to see if they're museum quality, or what we should do with them to preserve them?
Well, you're always free to send me pictures or post them on Facebook. Main thing I would say is do no harm. If you think you have something important, don't do anything to it.
Okay.
Typically, 99% of the cleaning I do is an old toothbrush under the faucet of a sink.
Okay, that's all I've done so far on
And
things I've
that's about all you
found.
should do. Occasionally soapy water instead of just water. Deionized water can help sometimes too. It will break up shale a little bit. There's a few examples of fossil plants where I've had to spray them with like Aquanet. You know, the hairspray your grandmother made her hair really puffy. You can buy that for 99 cents a can someplace. And when we go to the hazard area to collect plant fossils, if you don't spray the fossils down pretty much after you split the shale open, you end up coming home with just a bunch of crumbs. So you need to spray them with the Aquanet. It has a little bit of lacquer in it. And I always hate doing anything that you can't easily remove from a fossil, but in that case, you end up with nothing if you don't do something.
Yeah, I grew up in eastern Kentucky in the minefields, and we worked in the minefields all the time up there. And I was always keen to looking for the fossils. And all those plant fossils were real familiar because they're laying everywhere.
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
But one day I saw something, it was really special. I was doing a reclamation on one side of the hill and looking back at the cut, where the high wall where they were drilling. And they had blasted, and I saw one of the trees, vertical, just like in the picture. But as I stood back and looked at that distance, at the high wall, there was a whole tree there. I just started to, and it was massive. And I wish I'd had a camera to take it because I knew I was seeing something special, and I just couldn't believe my eyes. I quit my job for that day and just walked over to the high wall and was just to make sure that what I was seeing was there. And it's there, but you had to stand back to see the whole tree into the sandstone and shales there. It was in Breathitt County.
It's amazing, some of the things.
Oh yeah, I've never seen that. It's the only time I've ever, it was almost a complete tree. You could see massive limbs like an umbrella coming down. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, I've been in the Kentucky Geological Survey. They took pictures of lots of strip mines where you could see the high wall where there would be tree after tree, and then another layer of tree after tree, and then like a third forest on top. And it was just really amazing, some of the stuff. And it all gets blasted away. If you go on not Mountain Park, what used to be Daniel Boone Parkway, what is it now? What do they call 80 now? I forgot the name. I think it's Hal Rogers Parkway now. And when that first opened, there used to be stump after stump on the outcrops, and people have gone and taken them. There's a field guide that you can get for free at the Kentucky Geological Survey that describes all the outcrops there. And it shows on some of the cross sections where all the trees were, but now you can't find them. They're all gone. People have gone and collected them. I know many a coal miner has one on his front porch. I mean, that's just a neat thing to have. They're a roof hazard, and they're neat to find anyway. One of the neatest things I saw a picture of, and I was unable to document it anyplace else, somebody had one of these stumps, and there was a fossil fish inside of it, where apparently, this had rotted away and the stuff filled it out. Up in Nova Scotia, Bay of Fundy area, they actually find stumps that have early amphibians and reptiles preserved inside of them. And I think that's always a potential here in Kentucky. But when people think about fossil vertebrates, they think about great big dinosaur-sized things. All the bones are really tiny that would be very difficult to recognize. And I'm wondering how many times these stumps might have something really cool inside and people are missing it. And, it's one of these things that, there's probably lots of vertebrate fossils out there in eastern Kentucky, and people aren't noticing them because they're not the spectacular big things that you would think they would be.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. I'm running right here.
Just a curiosity and maybe a rumor, but I've heard tale of that a farmer was digging a pond off a Stedmantown Lane here in Franklin County, and they found a mastodon, and they stopped digging, and it's in some, it's in the basement at UK somewhere or anything. Do you know anything about that?
There's lots of examples.
Wilbur Rouse Nelson's mammoth that he found in 1945.
It's probably
So it is true.
It's probably in the geology department, but they have a little museum nobody, gets to go see. You have to make a special appointment to see. And it's a shame. It's a real shame that we don't have a natural history museum for all this stuff.
There's an account in, Wilbur Rouse Nelson published a pamphlet of it. I believe it was maybe even published in the Kentucky Historical Society about that account. And I know Richard Taylor in his book, Elkhorn, included that as well. Yes.
I saw him a few minutes ago.
But thank you all so much for coming. Mr. Phelps,
Thank you. Thanks.